Hey everyone, welcome to this beginner electronic soldering tutorial. I'm making this video to demonstrate good soldering technique and to break down the process into 5 easy steps. Stick with me, practice a bit, and you'll get good at it too. You'll need a soldering iron, something with which to clean your tip like a wet sponge or a brass sponge, some solder, and while optional, a pair of helping hands can really come in handy. One more note, solder is very hot. Its melting temperature is almost twice the temperature of boiling water. Hot metal looks the same as cold metal, so be really careful. Also, especially if you're a beginner, you should be wearing safety goggles. So let's jump right into it. For through-hole components in a circuit board, you'll want between 600 and 700 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 315 to 370 degrees Celsius. If you're soldering larger connections with more copper that's dissipating heat, then you may want a slightly higher temperature. With a temperature-adjustable iron, you can see what works and adjust accordingly. Next, make your components stay in place without your help. This is where you can use your helping hands. If you're soldering a through-hole component in a circuit board, you can bend the leads of the component into a V-shape so that it stays in place flush against the board. For components without long leads, you can use a piece of tape to hold them in place. There are any number of ways to keep your components steady, so feel free to get creative. Next, clean the tip of your iron. Use a brass sponge or a wet sponge to remove any oxidation or excess solder from the tip. A dirty tip is covered in metal oxides that transfer heat badly and can result in poorly soldered joints. Always remove excess solder because you'll only make reliable connections using fresh solder that has rosin in the core. Rosin acts like a flux when soldering, which eats away the oxide layers that form on the surfaces of metals. In fact, the smoke that you see when soldering is the flux burning away, not the solder itself vaporizing. Without flux in the solder to clean your surfaces, you'd have a very hard time getting the solder to wet. Now we're ready to apply solder. The whole principle is to heat up your joint evenly and melt solder onto the joint, not the tip of the iron. Apply the iron to one side of the components that you're trying to join, and feed solder from the other side. The amount of time it takes to heat the joint depends on its size, the temperature, and the power of the iron. Tiny connections can take a few seconds, but large connections dissipate more heat and will take longer. Remember to make as much contact as possible between the iron's tip and your part. Hold the flat edge of the iron's tip against the joint, not just the point of the iron. Sometimes it helps to tin your iron by putting a small amount of solder on the tip, to bridge the air gap between the iron's tip and your components to create better heat transfer. When you're done, remove first the solder and then the iron. The joint will need a few seconds to cool, so don't disturb it. Last, check whether you made a good connection. Did the solder wet to both surfaces? Is the joint smooth and shiny? Is there too much or too little solder? On a printed circuit board, the connection should make a volcano shape adhering smoothly to both the entire pad and the component lead. Finally, trim the leads of your components if you need to. So now that I've shown you some good examples, let me show you a bad example so you know what not to do. The first big no-no is putting a blob of solder onto your iron and trying to transfer it to your joint. This won't work because your flux burns away and you're not ensuring that your work pieces get hot enough for the solder to properly adhere. Secondly, don't grab your joint while it's hot. I didn't burn my finger here, but I easily could have. Third, your workpiece is sloppy if your components aren't properly aligned. This example is of course exaggerated, but beginners often don't ensure that parts are properly mounted flush against the board before they begin. So that's about it for this video. Leave me your questions and comments in the comment box below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this.